Would you intervene in such a case? A little girl was lying on the ground. A man unzipped the girl's trousers. He pressed his lips on the girl's lips. A passing lady saw this scene and fell to the ground in shock. She fled the scene and called the police. The police arrived and caught the man. His name was Paul. He had the IQ of a 6-year-old. The murder of a little girl by a bully aroused the anger of the people. Paul was taken to the crime scene by the police and made to repeat what he did to the girl that day on a mock-up doll, pressing her breasts, taking off her trousers, and kissing her lips. The policeman induced him to take off his trousers. Paul knew he couldn't remove his trousers with so many people around, but the police told him to take off his trousers so that he could see his daughter. As soon as Paul heard that he could see his daughter, he immediately started to do as he was told. The crowd was outraged. The court found that Paul was guilty of killing the little girl. But was that the truth? The mentally challenged man took off the little girl's pants. He was trying to improve blood circulation. Paul was congenitally retarded. He had the IQ of a 6-year-old. He lived with his daughter, Jane. Although they were poor, they were very happy. Jane had a crush on a school bag. Paul decided to give it to her as a gift for the first day of school. He took Jane to look at the shop window every day. He was waiting for his salary to be paid so he could buy it. That day, he found out another girl bought the last backpack. Paul touched the girl's face gently and asked if she would be willing to give him the bag. "We've been waiting for this bag for a long time." Out of nowhere, the girl's dad came up and socked him, then kept shoving. "Why did you touch my daughter?" Paul wanted to say something, but he got a slap from the man. When the daughter saw her father being beaten, she immediately stood in front of him and said, "Don't hit my dad. I don't want the school bag anymore. Dad, let's go home." They then left in frustration. The next day, Paul was counting his salary. The little girl passed by and saw Paul. She came over and said, "There are other shops that sell school bags." She wanted to take him there. The two of them went into a remote alley. Then the girl died. Paul was arrested as a suspect. The girl's father was the police chief. He wanted justice for his daughter. The police were under pressure from their leader to find evidence to convict Paul quickly. After arresting Paul, they brought him to the crime scene to reenact the case. Paul came to the crime scene in handcuffs, which was already surrounded by the public and the media. Paul pressed his hand against the dummy's chest on the ground. However, the police accused him of touching the girl's breasts. The police were so bad. Paul saved the unconscious girl. He slapped the girl's face to wake her up, but the police said he was slapping the girl, and they misinterpreted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation as a forced kiss. Paul unbuttoned his pants and muttered about improving blood circulation. The cops thought he was assaulting the girl. When Paul stopped moving, the police encouraged him to take off his trousers. Although Paul was 6 years old, he knew that he couldn't take off his trousers in public. However, the policeman told Paul to take off his trousers, then he could go back to see his daughter. Paul wanted to see his daughter, so he unbuttoned his trousers. When the crowd saw Paul removing his pants, they became furious. Someone rushed in and pulled off Paul's mask, and then they kicked and punched him. By then, Jane also saw her father crossing the blockade. She wanted to come to Paul's side, but Paul was pushed into the police car. Jane almost screamed her heart out as she watched the police car leave. Paul got the death penalty for murder and got thrown into that notorious prison number 7. A man with mental retardation went to prison. When the boss in the prison found out that Paul was in prison for raping and killing a little girl, the boss went up to him and slapped him on the head. Although they were criminals, they hated rapists the most, especially those who bullied the little girls. Paul tried to escape, but the other inmates blocked his way with blankets and beat him up. The boss's football business in prison was very prosperous. He stuffed cards in the footballs and kicked them over the fence in exchange for things the inmates needed. The behavior angered the others. Isolated by his fellow inmates, Paul was alone in a corner, thinking of his daughter. He took a branch and wrote down his daughter's name. When he looked up, he saw a strange man secretly sharpening the handle of a toothbrush. Then he stared at the boss with the sharpened toothbrush. However, the boss was still wandering around, unaware of the danger. A group of inmates wanted to assassinate the boss. Several people were running towards the boss. Paul couldn't think too much. He quickly ran over and pushed the boss away. He took the fatal blow himself. Looking at Paul, the boss pulled over the culprit and hit him with an elbow, knocking him to the ground. Then he stomped on him. The guards arrived and took Paul to the hospital. Boss owed Paul a favor and decided to grant him a wish. Paul said he misses his daughter. He wanted to see his daughter. Boss was in a dilemma, but since he promised, he had to do it. The boss used the church choir to get Jane into prison. She was hidden in a box and transported by the cellmate to reach the prison number 7. Opening the sealed box, a cute little girl came out. There's a little girl in the men's prison. Dad, hearing Jane's call, Paul excitedly came forward to hug her. Jane had tears in her eyes. She was crying and beating on Paul's chest. Paul hugged his daughter and kept apologizing. He thanked the boss for reuniting him with his daughter. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. The noise they made alerted the guards. Sam, a coward, worried that the guards would find out and add at least 2 years to his sentence. He got up and wanted to report to the guards. The other inmates were too anxious. The guards heard the shouts and came to the door. The other inmates rushed to cover Sam's mouth. The clever Jane hid under the door, in the blind spot of the guards. Just when Sam wanted to say something, Jane reached out her little hand and pulled Sam's finger pitifully. Her eyes were full of pleading, crying and begging him not to tell the truth. Sam was touched by Jane. He changed his mind at the last moment. The others were relieved. The daughter of an inmate was sneaked into the men's prison. Jane asked her dad why he was in prison. He was not a bad guy. Paul said that, other than him, all the other people were bad people. The inmates fell into silence. The situation became awkward. Jane didn't make it to the bus to depart. She then stayed in prison number 7. The inmates were scared every day. The guards checked 12 times a day. They were scared to be found out. Jane lived and ate with the inmates. She also had to hide from the guards who came to check on them. When they heard something outside the door, they hid Jane in a corner. When the guards heard a girl's voice, someone had to pretend to be a woman. Jane sang and danced for the inmates. The prison was full of laughter. The good situation didn't last long. Jane hid behind the door during the guard's inspection, but this time, the guard found out that something was wrong. A little girl was hiding in prison. The guards came to check the room and opened the hole under the door. The inmates were quick to lift Jane up, but the warden of the prison caught them. The warden found Jane. He brought out Paul. Paul was worried about Jane's health. When the warden heard this, he got angry. He grabbed Paul's collar and threw him to the ground. Paul defended that he didn't kill the girl, but the warden didn't listen to his explanation. He kicked him and put him in the lockup. At night, Paul woke up from the smoke. It turned out to be an arson attack by a prisoner. The other inmates ran frantically. The warden was trapped in the fire, trying to save the inmates. Paul tried to find someone to save the victims, but no one cared. Despite the danger, Paul broke through the barriers and rushed into the fire to save the warden. The warden came to his senses. Seeing Paul, who was badly burnt, he was in doubt. Does he really kill the girl? Paul took off a girl's trousers in the street and gave her artificial respiration. He was wrongfully imprisoned. His daughter, Jane, came to visit him. He kept praising Jane to her teacher. He told Jane to take care of herself and wait for him to come home. The warden's suspicion deepened. Would a father who loves his child like this harm other children? When Jane came home, she started a hunger strike. She begged the warden to put her in jail too. The warden couldn't bear it. The warden put Jane in a box and sent her to Paul. The warden came to Paul and asked him the question he always wanted to ask. Paul didn't know how to answer. The warden found out something was wrong with Paul's confession. How could a mentally retarded man with an IQ of 6 years old write down a confession clearly? The warden asked to reinvestigate the case, but faced with a refusal from the police chief. After all, it was the police chief's daughter who died. The man who saved a little girl by giving her artificial respiration was sent to prison. His fellow inmates noticed something was wrong. They helped Paul reorganize his case. The truth finally emerged. That day, the girl slipped on the ice and fell on the ground. Because of her school bag, she hit the back of her head and died on the spot. Paul unzipped her trousers to help her blood circulation. Then he did mouth-to-mouth artificial respiration. Because the one who died was the police chief's daughter, Paul became the culprit. To help Paul clear his name, his inmates helped him to write his defense in court so that he could memorize it. But when he went to court, in front of the judge, Paul's eyes were full of tears. He confessed to the crime. The warden told him to come to his senses. Paul looked at his daughter. He kept repeating that he was wrong. The judge upheld the verdict. It turned out that before Paul went to court, the police chief put him in solitary confinement. He threatened him with Jane's life. For the sake of his daughter, Paul confessed. Jane was adamant that her father was not a bad person. At the end of every visit, when Jane counted 1, 2, 3, Paul would immediately appear and make a happy face at her. Jane would also wave goodbye to her father. Soon, the date of execution was set. It was on Christmas Day. Everyone in the prison couldn't bear to let Paul die like this. The boss, looking at the colorful paintings on the wall, made an escape plan with his cellmates. Using their work as an advantage, they made a huge hot air balloon. Paul hugged Jane and sat on the hot air balloon. The cellmate next to him let go of the rope. The hot air balloon flew higher and higher. The people in the prison cheered enthusiastically. Paul and Jane said goodbye to the people on the ground with excitement. The warden also smiled with relief. The other guards tried to stop the balloon, but the inmates stopped them. The balloon was about to fly out of the fence, but the rope was caught in the wire. The people who were fighting silently stopped fighting. They collectively stared at Paul and Jane and fell into the silence, regretting that they had put so much efforts these days. They still couldn't save Paul and Jane, although they all knew that it's hard to break out of prison. But this was the only thing the inmates could do for them. The date of execution had come. Today was the last day of the man's life. Paul unzipped her trousers to save the little girl. He wanted to improve blood circulation, but in the end, he became a murderer. Today was Jane's birthday. Paul fed his daughter the last breakfast. The inmate took out a birthday cake. Jane blew out the candles. Everyone gave gifts to congratulate Jane on her birthday. Jane also received her favorite school bag. She got up and knelt to her dad.
태어나게 해주셔서 감사합니다.
Paul hugged his daughter tightly.
태어나서 고맙습니다.
The inmates were so moved that they couldn't hold back their tears. The boss wrote a blessing on Paul's prison uniform. Paul thanked everyone and said goodbye. He held Jane's hand and walked out. With heavy steps, Jane looked at his dad with a smile and thought that he was just changing his cell. He held Jane tightly and walked forward step by step. Finally, it's time to say goodbye. Paul was going to be executed. He couldn't bear to let go of his daughter. He tidied up her hair, holding back the tears in his eyes. He told Jane that, even if he would not be by her side from now on, she had to go on alone. Well, Jane hoped that her dad would go on by himself too. When she grew up, she would come back to find her dad. Paul responded with difficulty. He knew that there would be no more future. Jane finally wished Paul,
아빠, 메리 크리스마스.
The prison door opened. Paul hugged Jane tightly. Tears burst out from his eyes. He hugged Jane tightly in his arms, but the moment he let go, he immediately put on a smile. He smiled and wished Jane a Merry Christmas. The warden put his hand on Paul's shoulder and reminded him that it was time for Jane to leave. Then, he took Jane out of the prison. The gate was relocked, separating Paul from Jane. Jane could only look at her father's back. The daughter sent her father to the scene of the shooting. Jane waved nicely. In order not to make Jane worry, Paul was making a happy face at the corner, and Jane also responded him. The two of them were enjoying this happy moment. Turning the corner, Paul collapsed on the ground in a flash, and Jane looked at the distance through the railing, counting again and again. 1, 2, 3. But Paul didn't appear again. She shouted loudly.
아빠!
Paul couldn't hold back any longer. When he heard his daughter's call, he rushed out and hugged his daughter. They cried through the railing. The men hissed and cried out for help. He grabbed the railing and pleaded over and over again. Warden's eyes were red. He turned his head away and did not look at him anymore. Jane's eyes was also full of tears, pleading. Paul was convicted of murder for giving artificial respiration to a little girl on the street. He would be executed soon. Paul put his hands together and knelt down. His attitude was extremely humble. He desperately took the guard's hand and kept repeating. At this moment, he wanted to be with his daughter, but even this tiny wish was doomed to be unfulfilled. The sound of Paul's cries echoed in the prison. His inmates were also sad for him, saddened by Paul's fate and the unfairness of the sentence. Jane cried out with pitiful. She didn't understand why such a kind father would end up like this. Jane was adopted by the warden. 20 years later, she became a lawyer and went to court to overturn her father's sentence. All Paul's former cellmates and the warden testified for him. They gave a tearful speech. Everyone in the courtroom was moved. The judge declared Paul not guilty. There was thunderous applause. After 20 years of wrongful conviction, Paul was finally cleared of all wrongdoing. On a snowy day, Jane looked into the distance, as if she saw her father and herself in the hot air balloon. They said goodbye happily and flew to a faraway place. She hoped that Paul was well in heaven, and Jane would be happy for the rest of her life. This movie is called Miracle in Cell No. 7. Question for today's episode: are you touched by the story? This is a good movie. I recommend watching the full movie. Well, that's it for today's episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye.